in decision making. And we're joined by some awesome panelists today, Angelica, Nexus, Terell, Tehvon, and they're all people that I really admire as leaders, and they're people that I think are challenging the status quo in terms of how we work and how we operate as arts administrators. So I'm very excited for the discussion that's going to unfold today. Before we dive in, let's do a quick round of introductions around the table. So Angelica?
Hey everyone, good morning. My name is Angelica Cortez. I am the Executive Director of the Suzuki Association of the Americas. I'm also a proud alum of Sphinx Lead, and I teach at USC.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Tehvon Fowler-Chapman. I am the Vice President of LA Opera Connects at LA Opera, and SphinxConnect, or Sphinx Lead, actually, cohort 1, so OG there, which is great. And just a quick props to my team at LA Opera Connects because they're probably not awake yet. But the reason that I can actually be here right now is because they are super awesome, and I'm able to put a lot of trust in them to, do a really great job managing programs while I'm away. So.
Hi, good morning. My name is Terell Johnson. I'm the Executive Director of the Chicago Philharmonic. I also serve as the chair of the co-residence for the Harris Theater of Music and Dance, where I'm also a board member, and I'm a board member of the Illinois Council of Orchestras, and also a Sphinx Lead alum, a cohort 3. Just really excited to be here and to chat with you this morning.
Hello, everyone. My name is JR Nexus Russ. Pronouns are he and they. By day, I'm the public affairs specialist at the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities, but I'm here wearing my Dear Nexus hat, EDI consulting practice I started during the pandemic, and yeah, looking forward to bringing that. Having worn many hats over my career as an artist, from boy soprano to theater artist and dancer, and actually 30 years on Saturday will have been to the day I sang at Thurgood Marshall's memorial service at the National Cathedral when I was a boy soprano. So that's a really interesting moment that I'm thinking about as I'm here with you all.
All right, thank you so much. So to kick us off, when I was first broached with this topic as a panel discussion, there was a tweet that had been making the social media rounds a little while ago that immediately came to mind for me. And that's this. I'm sure you all have probably seen this. For accessibility reasons, I'm just going to briefly describe the image that's being projected. It's a tweet by Praveen Kumar, and it says, companies, in quotes, we're committed to diversity. The diversity. And the company is represented in a pyramid structure with 4 tiers and with emoji faces. The top tier is 1 white man, below him 3 white men, below them 3 white men, 1 white woman, and below them 5 folks of varying skin colors and presumably varying races or ethnicities. So it's of course a very simplified illustration of this issue, right? I'm sure many of you have heard the term snowcap to describe this common phenomenon, and it's making the point that, well, is it really diversity, or is it really meaningful diversity if it's just the folks in the entry or lower level staffing where we see any diversity within the company? And the underlying reason being that in this traditional hierarchy, it's typically just the folks at the top that hold power and decision-making ability. So today I'd like to frame this as a yes and discussion. Yes, absolutely, we need diversity in terms of the perspectives and underrepresented identities in that snowcap region. And can we start to challenge the modes of operation within this hierarchical system so that staff of all levels can play a more integrated role in the decision-making process, particularly when those decisions are affecting the trajectory of an organization and therefore the day-to-day for all of these staff. So I'd love to open up the floor and ask our panelists, what are some ways in which we can ensure that staff at all levels can be treated as true stakeholders in the decision-making process?
I'll definitely start, and I'd never heard the snowcap piece, which is a new concept for me. especially for me, a big philosophy in terms of management and leadership is treating employees and people that report to me within my department the way that I would have wanted to have been treated as a junior staffer myself. And a lot of learning in the past about what I did enjoy and working at other places and how I did feel heard, and how I did not, and kind of thinking about that as it relates to my, the people who I work with in my department in LA Opera Connects, because it's not about the title that makes your thoughts valid or makes your opinions valid. It's really about the perspective that you bring, and everyone brings different perspectives. There are certain things that I know about a program that my assistants or my managers would not know, or my directors would not know. And there are so many things about our programs that I have zero context into because I'm not on the ground every day, but they are. And so making space for this is how I'm feeling about it on the larger scale or on the kind of the bigger picture from my purview, and checking that with what the reality is for them as they are doing the work is super important for me, because otherwise I'm just making a lot of decisions that aren't actually informed by what is going on. And so that's a really big, important factor for me as this is my 3rd or 4th month in this job, that open communication and inviting them to actually, before I even ask, to say, this is what's not working, or this is what is working, this is what's going really well, encourages that open line of communication regardless of what is going on a given day.
Yeah, and I also feel like one of the limits that we face is, or one of the core aspects of issues that come up is just communication, right? I think you making the time to make sure that your staff is able to speak with you, and also we've talked about this before, we all have to work really hard at communicating what we're understanding, right? I think when you're in for most people feel like they're in some sort of middle ground, right? I know even as an executive director, I'm in between the board and my staff, right? And even though I'm in theory at the top of that hierarchy, I don't always feel that way, right? And so there's some work that I need to do to make sure that I'm communicating out, these are the areas that I know I can make this decision, and this area, I don't actually have that responsibility. That responsibility lies to the board. And being able to communicate that actually takes quite a bit of time, quite a bit of transparency, and a lot of relationship building. So I think there's a book that I read called Multipliers that really resonates with what you're talking about, Tehvon. This concept of what are you doing to multiply the intelligence around you, right? How do you make sure that the people that are with you really feel that they have the authority that they need to do what they do, that you trust them as a human being and as an individual, not just as the person kind of on the ground doing the work, that you value and understand that they make the work better on a day-to-day basis. And where are you kind of deflating that? And I think another way that we organizationally hold ourselves back is that we don't question our assumptions. And that goes for anyone in any role, right? I know that I fall short often in not letting my staff make decisions and instead just being like, no, I'm going to do this because this is what I think is best. Sometimes it's a question of time. Sometimes it's a question of, my just kind of operating on go mode. We all have a bunch of deadlines that we're working against. We all have a bunch of, kind of things that we're trying to meet. So.
And that whole time piece is a big one. And a lot of places that I've been to, the biggest obstacle, or one of the biggest obstacles to open communication and thoughtful discussion surrounding how we can work better together it's just the fact that everyone is constantly running around trying to get things done. So another part of what I try to do within my work as a leader is slow down our work at times when we can, so that we actually do have time to discuss, build in those that part for thoughtful discussion and planning, and make sure that everyone is a part of that planning process, so that they don't just feel like they're constantly just running around trying to get the next thing done.
I think another thing organizations can do, especially when you bring in consultants, especially when talking about EDI work and other similar topics, is to really have a moment to ask yourself, like, what was learned from this consultant? And one thing that I noticed just even in my first year was the through line was I was creating a space for the staff to share things candidly and without consequence. And that made me feel a little weird because I felt like that's a cultural thing, right? That's a structural and institutional thing. And if you're only doing that when you have someone come in that provides some kind of buffer, right? Some kind of like feeling and space of safety from consequence for saying challenging things, then that work still needs to happen even after the consultant leaves. So I think having a moment to be like, did the consultant share anything that the staff hasn't already been saying, even if they haven't been saying in staff meetings and maybe in the hallways or water coolers? So I think it's like when you think about bringing an outside perspective in, are they actually sharing an outside perspective or something that you just aren't hearing and receiving?
I guess going back to the graphic that you showed, I kind of think of that as like a cruise ship where, and I use this example a lot with my staff. That structure has the mentality where it's you can't pivot, you can't turn quick, it's not dynamic, it has lots of history and it's massive, but it's not really suitable for creativity and flexibility. And so I always like have the term, my staff we're small but mighty, and I think that's really essential, and that comes from being, we really find time to connect. I think email is great, but I like to get up, I like to get my steps in, so I oftentimes like do a lot of work side by side. Like I get my laptop, we'll sit down, we'll really connect and talk because like really great ideas are coming from those dynamic conversations. And I like with email, it's like if you go on a long vacation and you're super stressed when I get back, oh my God, like you know it's gonna be this massive like cram of messages, but always start from the end because when you read it back, all that stuff has been done because it was all a waste of time. It's like never start an email, it's thread from the beginning, like the day you left on vacation. Always read it from the day you got back and you're like, everything is done. And that's because a lot of the time is wasted with like that top-down structure, people sending lots of things to people, and so really I think like being dynamic, listening to the team, like letting them be empowered to do the things they need to do, because a lot of action does come from in the pyramid on the level at the bottom that's the most diverse and most creative. So really, like turning the pyramid sideways or really flipping it around to be more equitable, but also just more flexible, and it's really a space for fostering creativity. So that's something I've really made essential in the work I'm doing, and also coming from different spaces where I've been on a dynamic team or I've been on a cruise ship or so. Yeah.
I love that cruise ship image.
All kinds of vacation.
Oh yeah.
Maybe it's on my mind because it's so cold out. I don't know.
But yeah, absolutely. With that kind of shape, you have a lot more flexibility. It's active. It's in motion. So thanks for sharing that. I love that. I wanted to go back to that point, Nexus, that you made. And one in our prep conversations, I loved this. You called it creating an abundance of space for candor. And I think you're absolutely right that a lot of times the conversations are in stagnation or not happening at all across these tiers or across departments. And it's not until a consultant comes in where that space is being created. So I'm wondering if you want to kind of embellish a bit on, how can organizations be more intentional about creating those spaces of candor?
Sure. I think one thing that was important to me, and this is from a book I read, I forget the author, it's called Creativity, Inc., and it was about the life of Pixar and how they work as an institution and differentiating between being candid and being honest, because there's like a false binary in being like honest or not, right? And I think I was definitely in a lot of organizations where we were a family and we were honest with each other and like both were lies. And I think when they talked about being candid, it was acknowledging that sometimes you don't have the room or space or feel safe enough to be completely honest, and so you're trusting people to use their own best judgment about how much they can share and when and where. And I think part of what I appreciate in that nuance is it acknowledges that are barriers that might have nothing to do with who you are as people. Just if I'm talking to an executive director in my org, there's just a power relationship that is fundamentally affecting any conversation. And I think being candid acknowledges that without putting blame on like, oh, you're just like a power hoarder, even if that's what some people are. But I think so really even understanding the language of the values you have and like looking at candor as this like nuanced thing, this fluid thing, rather than like, just be honest with me. Because I think, again, if you have power, that is just a catch-22 and you're setting people up for failure.
Yeah, I think the other thing that comes to mind for me as we're thinking about that is just the ability to have difficult conversations in the moment, right? And your ability to see something and say something. I think it can feel, especially like whether you're on the side of feeling powerless or on the side of feeling powerful, it's so important that you stay mindful, right, of who is in the space and of what might have come up. I try really hard to stay in the practice of saying, after a meeting maybe, did something come up for you? Just opening the door for that conversation to happen is so important. And I feel like what ends up happening in especially big institutions is over and over again you have missed moments of did something come up for you? And what the people that end up hurting the most from that are the people at the bottom of that pyramid most often.
And also within this whole piece is how you deal with the urgency felt by staff. There are so many times in which I, like starting out before I became an executive director, before I became a vice president, was like, this is something that I'm actually really concerned about. This is, there are things that I would like to adjust so that this job works a little bit better. And it's always a thing of, you're right, but we're either not ready to do it, or you're right, but like we're never going to do that, or anything, like any sort of acknowledgement of the importance of it, or just sheer lip service to the importance of it. And neither of those are really constructive for the people that I'm trying to work with. And so, the other piece of this is that if someone's expressing an amount of urgency regarding a matter that relates to a program or to personnel, et cetera, part of my job in supporting staff and creating a space that provides support and resources is making sure that I respond to that sense of urgency in a timely manner, and making sure that there is follow-up and those people actually feel heard when they aren't bringing things up, regardless of whether they're a director, assistant, et cetera. That is something that I always felt lacking coming up, which is like, you're not really responding to my needs right now. And I'm trying to do a better job, which is why I'm asking for this thing, or why I'm asking for you to look into this. And so I'm trying to, kind of change the game on that, which is let's respond with a little bit more urgency as leaders, as directors, as managers.
Yeah, and Tehvon, you had kicked off the conversation by mentioning that your title is not necessarily bear weight on you having the best or right ideas or more valid ideas. And I wanted to talk about that a bit, about conflating folks' titles with their experience.
Yeah. It's such a funny story because so I started my job at LA Opera in like 4 months ago, October 2022. There was no vice president in this position for over a year. And despite that, nothing really bad happened. A lot of our programs were able to continue, and what happened was a lot of staff who were not in that position of power or authority actually rose up and rose to the challenge to kind of fill that void of leadership. And what that taught me was that, one, it's a lot easier when I share the space for leadership with the people who are around me, because they're more than capable of doing it. And once again, because I don't have the full picture. I have a big picture, but I don't have all the details. some of the things that I might want to do may not be informed. They may not actually be the best idea. And so for me, there's a lot of like, oh, I really would like to do this. I think that this is the thing that needs to happen. And then after that consensus building, I realize, oh, actually, that's wrong. Let's go back to the drawing board for that. And as much as acknowledging within myself that it's not the best idea, also being able to say, well, okay, I was mistaken about this. Well, this is still what I'm feeling. Let's look at another alternative. Let's look at something that bridges the gap more between what I'm thinking and what the realities of our situation are. But yeah, there's the whole thing with leadership is that it's not actually, especially as it relates to the art, and we're so used to centering a lot of our work around the art and around artists. It's not actually about me as a leader. My department is not about my artistic vision. It's not about my strategic it's a little bit, but it's not always about that. It's about us being able to do the work for the communities that we serve. It's important for me as a leader to decenter myself and my own needs from the decision-making process and consider, diverse perspectives and backgrounds in order to make the best, most informed decision.
I would say, serving in a role as an executive director, like vision, title, power, really, I can have a vision for the organization. I can have a vision for steering it, but I think the power is really important that it's shared with the team, because although we've created this vision together, execution is happening with the team members, and so access is really important. So like our organization, it's really important to me that the staff has access to the board, and that communication doesn't just come from me. Board meetings, I'm not just the only person speaking. I kind of speak the least at times because the experts are in the room. Like I have my marketing person who is totally in charge of that lane, and so that's the expert for reporting on that material. We might prepare it together, but really the power is with that individual. If it's with fundraising, making sure that access to the board members is so important, because it also builds culture and it sets a precedent. Like, okay, they understand that they don't have to just go to me for something. They can directly go to a team member who's on the ground working hard after we created that vision. So I think titles are important outside. It's really this weird thing because we all try to build a great culture, and then once you leave like that space, and you interact with another organization, as we all do, they might be really accustomed to titles, and it's so easy to see when terrific organizations are building great cultures, and you are collaborating with other groups, then like, okay, we got to bring them on, because like we don't need a vice president or director to talk to another vice president or director. like things can be shared. So I would love to see a space where other organizations can be more collaborative and also accepting, like, you don't need to go straight to the top every time for creativity and for things to be versatile and flexible.
And I think related to this, right, I think once you start in asking this question and you're curious about what are we conflating with like roles and responsibilities, like even something as simple as like who's setting the agenda for your staff meetings, right? If I was at a small org where the ED just did it regularly, and I remember one time she was a little overwhelmed. I was like, what if we were like 5 people? We started rotating, right? Kind of shared leadership of our time together, and that also takes something off your plate, lets us practice facilitating our time together, but also you get a sense of what we understand to be the priority of our organization. Let's say you're with a larger organization, you could do that with your like senior leadership. But it's like such a simple thing, but I think there's a lot of power in literally agenda setting, like setting your time together and what you're gonna talk about and address. So I think once you start, again, get curious about what are the assumptions we're making about who does what regarding roles and responsibilities, you can really, especially if you're talking about shared leadership and shared power, you can start doing that in every aspect of your organizational life.
Tehvon, were you about to jump in?
I was just going to say, I have an agenda, but a lot of other people on my team also have agendas. So it's, everyone has an agenda that they have to go through, and making space for that it's really important in terms of, again, having a fuller picture of what is going on in your organization and your department.
Yeah, I feel like a really good indicator for shared power is how many questions you're asking, right? Like, how often do you step into the room and have to be the person to talk, not have to be, see, there I am. They all know what I look like. But really, like, how often do you go in a room and just start talking rather than asking questions and getting curious? I think it's just, and I think, too, we all care about the work that we're doing. All of us are here because we care about what we're doing. We're all in nonprofit systems. It's very, very high likelihood that you're putting in more time than you're actually getting paid for. And so because of that, we're often willing to, or we say to ourselves, you know, I'm talking a lot, or I'm doing this, I'm setting up the agenda because I care, because it's important to me. Well, it's really important, again, that we acknowledge that that's actually me and my need, right? And can I step back and make sure that I'm checking in on the needs of the other folks in the room? And do I actually, again, getting curious about your own assumptions, do I actually assume that I need to do that? Is that coming from me? Is that coming from the culture that was created before I got here? Where's that coming from? And I think the culture that is created in any given space is limited by our falling short of asking those questions and stopping and starting to say, oh, well, I already do that. Because I know I do that too when I step into conference spaces where you're just like, yeah, we do that. Yeah, I let my staff speak. Okay, well, what's the next step? How much further are you willing to go?
Yeah, totally. And I think there are a lot of default mode things that come with working within a lot of traditional systems or just our work in general. So let's pivot to that. Like, what are some other pitfalls or things we do just because we're in the habit of doing them? And can we start to question some of those things? So Nexus, you kind of shared, you know, the agenda thing, right? That the executive director or whoever's at the top has to be the agenda setter. What are some other things that we just do out of default mode, but can be questioned and change and help shift this culture?
One of the things that we had also talked about in our prep was about just how our organizational structures for arts organizations don't always work. And that's kind of another thing that I try to break, in which, you know, not making it such a siloed piece in which, you know, LA Opera Connects is not the only voice in terms of community education and outreach. There are things that everyone is a part of a community that we are not a part of within our organization, and it's important to kind of add more of those voices to it. For a lot of our digital programming, one of the things that we have set as a rule, or that I've set as a rule, within what Connects does online is, yes, we know how to, what kind of content we want to present, but also there's a certain way that our marketing department and our communications departments want to set the tone within different audiences. Rather than working separately and trying to say, well, we've created this thing, can you sell it? What we have started doing is saying, well, this is actually more of a collaborative effort. Our digital programs are now teams comprising of not just Connect's programming staff, but also marketing staff, so that we, they are helping us contribute to content, actual research, what kinds of things we want to talk about, what things we want to cover that are relevant not just to Connect's initiatives, but are also relevant to marketing and communications initiatives. And breaking down a lot of those, those barriers, those silos within the organization, it shows that there's a different way of working across the organization that allows us to be more informed of other departments. I always think about what kind of leverage my work does for other departments, and that is, in doing so, it's important that, that work is also happening. We're building teams within those. So, within that, marketing connects. We have connects fundraising and finance, so that we're actually building the right tools to track the work that we're doing, and that we're not duplicating our efforts, and we're making the right things for everyone. And what it does is it actually cuts down on the amount of time that we spend doing a lot of the same stuff. It ends up being more efficient and more effective for us.
I think prioritizing communication is another thing that comes up, because I feel like I've worked at a few places where, you know, it's been said to me, you know, you have full say, this is your project, run with it. And it's like, okay, cool, I'm gonna do this. And then it's like, ooh, well, but you totally forgot this point and this point and this point. And well, okay, well, I didn't have that context, right? So, you know, if you're not able, and again, this is a timing thing, right? If you're not prioritizing communication and giving your team or the people that are working in your organization a full picture of here's the budget and here's why we made that decision. Most of the time people are operating on their best guess and or as much information as they possibly have, and then there's a gap in knowledge. So I think unfortunately, again, because everyone's trying to get things done so quickly, right? A lot of us are working on grants that are due at X time, at X day, and you just gotta get the thing through the door, whatever it is. If we're able to prioritize communication and transparency in that communication, then I think we'll have a little bit of a different result when it comes to empowering or making sure that people feel like they actually have a say in what they're doing.
I think related to that, one thing that comes to mind that has been kind of said, but I just really want to highlight again, is like so often we think about our work and our role, and it's like, what do we need from other people in other departments versus like really thinking about what then do other people need from me? And just like even flying here yesterday with my day job, I got an email being like, hey, we have a grant program that needs to go up on our website. And I'm like trying to get internet on the airplane. I'm like, because I'm the website manager. And then I look at the application date, and it actually launched on Monday. I'm like, how did I not hear about this until Thursday? And so because like they were just worried, I'm sure, giving them grace, worried about getting it up, right, and just getting it out, and they didn't think, oh, we actually also need to have that be on our website or an email. So it's like, what do other people need from me with the work that I do as well? And then like really, I don't know, living in that duality.
I have a quick question. I'm curious about communication and like how we communicate, because I know we're talking about communication, but like what are the best systems that you guys have used to communicate? Is it email? Is it one-on-one? Slack? Because I feel like sometimes we can over-communicate, but it's not like we're penetrating. So I'm just, sorry, Kathy, I'm jumping in, but I'm so curious, like, what are some of the best systems you guys have used that we could share?
I mean, for me, a big part of it is, one of the things is like how you communicate. As similar to you, so I'm on a totally different floor from most of my team. I get a lot of steps in. I should probably get an Apple Watch to keep track of it, but you know, one of the things for me is a lot of the face-to-face communication, actually a lot of meetings to share not just what I need from people, but also kind of do the strategic plan sharing with them so that they know this is what I'm thinking about, long-term, big picture, how does this work with you? And so it's a lot of in-person conversation and a lot of phone calls, probably more than what they'd actually want. The other side to it is what I share and what I communicate. And so, you know, as it relates to financials and budgets, I might be more transparent than I should be with my staff, but the thing is that they won't be able to, if they have a grand vision, I can't give them the access to do a program and then limit them with information that they don't have. Coming back and saying, oh, this isn't in the budget actually, or they don't want you to do this, et cetera, like that's not gonna be helpful. Making sure that they have the full picture, which includes not just the autonomy to do it, but also the necessary context. That is really how I communicate. I arm them with knowledge and with information needed to make their best decision.
Yeah, I think a couple of things are coming up for me. One is I think having a system, again, for difficult conversations is actually like one of the most important ones, right? There's a great organization named Reframe Phoenix, and they have a system of, I didn't like that, right? So if something comes up in a meeting that doesn't feel good, you say it. There is a culture embedded there of saying, didn't like that. It's not personal, it's not an attack, but it's an opportunity for you to raise something that has come up in conversation, because those things happen, right? And I think, again, questioning the assumption of, oh, like, we have a great team culture. If that's your thought, you might start to ask yourself the question, well, what are the ways that that starts to fall apart, or when does the space not feel so great? Because it happens all the time, because we're humans and we'll have different experiences and different lenses and different views of the work. So I think that having a system of didn't like that is an important one. And on a technical level, so my organization spans across Canada, the US, and Latin America. And we, when I started, did not have very good systems. And I would say we're still needing to improve the systems of making sure that, we're based in the US, and so most of what we're writing is coming here from the US. Things like Happy Memorial Day don't resonate in other countries. And so really starting to get familiar in your head with what your limits are. I've learned so much about where my limits are in terms of a US frame and context, right? And you have to understand that, again, different people have different lenses and different experiences. So really, in terms of communication, starting to think about, okay, so what are my limits in terms of understanding and reaching people? And who do I need to bring in to make sure that we're reaching all of the people that are in our network?
Oh, I like that. I had this, you reminded me of something. I had a team member who, so the Philharmonic, we have 200 musicians, and it's a society of musicians, so there's, basically we represent 7 orchestras in Chicago, and it's like this collection of the highest level of talent. And so with that, communication is so key, especially for the staff that handles personnel, and is communicating with all these different folks who span several other organizations and come together for performances with the Chicago Philharmonic. And so this person was having a hard time communicating with someone, and they came to me like, I'm having a hard time, we're just not on the same page. And so I was like, okay, catch me up to speed. And they showed me this massive email thread. It was way too long. And I'm from the generation that was like always on the phone. And that's just how it was. I love talking on the phone. And this person is a little younger than me, and so they more like text, and everything was through like text or email. And I was like, have you called them? And no, why would I call? Everything's written here. But like, if you guys have seen that Key and Peele skit where the friend is like texting like, hey, let's go out, and the other person's like, when he gets it back, like, let's go out, and he's like, they're totally not on the same page. And I was explaining to them like, although your intention might be clear to you about what you're writing in this email, it's not clear to the other person, and they might be reading it in a totally different tone. And sometimes it's best to just get on the phone, just have a call. And so, like, I was asking about the way people communicate and how it's effective, because for me, I've noticed that sometimes, if they're not getting the point across, it's best to just pick up the phone or find time for lunch. But in the digital age with Zoom, like sometimes it's hard for people to want to connect because it's more convenient, but sometimes it's more efficient just to talk on the phone.
I literally had to like say to one of my staff members, like, I'm sorry for this message. I don't know how my tone comes across in Microsoft Teams. And, like, this is not an attack. This is just me speaking very plainly. Like, it's that Key and Peele. Like, he could show up in my office with an axe ready to fight. So yeah, that's why I call people actually.
Yeah, so going back to the, so how do we, makes me think about how do we have those difficult conversations or more penetrating conversations? And I think that there's a lot of groundwork relationship building too, because, we talk about candor and honesty, but, and this kind of goes back to the whole topic about not conflating someone's title with like that being the only part about someone. And I think that, I think it just has to be said that across the board, can we just acknowledge each other as human beings too, and not talking to someone constantly only as their professional selves, but knowing that this person's also bringing a lot of life experiences, a lot of knowledge or expertise that we may not even know because we don't have those more like human to human conversations, and I think there's such a wealth of resource there that is totally not tapped into. So I think that's also really important too, that You know, you're not just talking to the social media coordinator. This is someone that had, you know, a 10-year professional dance career and, you know, has been all over the world, and, you know, things like this that I have been in some institutions where, like, I could go months and months without, like, knowing anything personal, and not that, you know, I need a ton of vulnerability from someone, but there's this just, like, kind of disconnect of, like, yes, we're here to do the work, but we're also people too, and we're bringing a lot more to the table.
Yeah, I feel like some of that, again, boils down to your own limits and your own kind of capacity. Like, honestly, what's coming up to me as you're talking is going to therapy, right? And being able to understand that when someone's saying, like, I didn't like what you did here, it's not about me, right? Being able to separate the individual from whatever it is that you think the problem is, right? So how much work are you doing at an individual level to kind of understand what you're contributing to, and the things that, are you open to change? Are you open to navigating difference? Like, how much are you doing? How much you're doing as an individual limits how far your organization can actually go.
Yeah, and I think there's so much ego that can be tied, right? And it's, like, not about you at all. Don't flatter yourself. And particularly when it comes to, like, historical practices, to, like, take it personally almost, when really we're just trying to ask the questions, like you say, constantly ask questions, like, why are we doing this? What is the context? Is it actually effective?
The only other thing I would say is the importance of grace for, like, going back to that whole pyramid piece. You know, there are a lot of times where, you know, the grace is given all the time for people who are in leadership positions, and not nearly extended to the same amount for people who are in those lower levels. And so it's like, if I'm going to trust you to do something, I'm also not going, I need to make space for you to make mistakes. I need you to learn from these failures in a way, learn from failures in the same way that I do, which is, you know, saying, this did not work out, let's redraw, and, you know, providing that support rather than, you know, immediately taking the carrot away and responding with a stick. It's not helpful. I feel like it's also a little discriminatory when we think about who is really receiving the brunt of those, like, of that punishment for making really simple mistakes. Unless someone is actively, like, in danger, or, like, it's something that is really bad. Like, I try to respond with a lot of grace when things do not go the way that we want, and, you know, I'm not totally tied to that issue. So the grace piece is also another part of seeing everyone as complete humans who are coming into that work.
So I knew that this hour would go by super fast. It's Q&A time. So we've got a mic here in the center for in-person questions. We also have been accepting some virtual questions. So feel free to come up. Brianna, do we have any questions?
Hi, I'm the engagement liaison here at Sphinx, and we do have one anonymous question that was just submitted. It states, as a manager in a small arts education nonprofit, how do you navigate differences in viewpoints based on age and differences, Gen Z/millennial versus boomers/Gen X?
Yeah, age is something that definitely came up in our conversation. So I'm glad it's come up.
That's a really good question.
So, well, let me help here, because Tehvon, one of the things that I love that you said, sorry to put you on the spot, is about how age traditionally in these structures can play a role in seniority, and, like, again, that feeling of, like, oh, well, your ideas are going to be more valid, and how you had said that it's ironic, since a lot of organizations are trying to attract that younger audience, and yet they won't listen to those voices within the organization.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm by far I'm probably the youngest senior staffer for LA Opera probably ever, definitely right now. And one of the things, at least for me, because it's similar to racial diversity, which is it is my time, but also it's everyone's time. As it relates to kind of that question, it's acknowledging, one, the need for new ideas and innovative ideas, and saying that just because someone is young does not mean that they don't have the expertise, the background, or experience to do it. And I say that as a 31-year-old VP, but also recognizing the value also of the older opinions. I think that, on the other side, just because they are from a different generation and you don't disagree with all of the things that they say, does not mean that they do not have crucial knowledge, historical context, wisdom that they can pass down. And I think it's an important part, which is seeing what everyone within the organization has to offer and making sure that they understand that, making sure they are on the same page as well, which is there are parts that you have to contribute as a member of Gen X or baby boomers, and that millennial or that Gen Z person has a lot to offer as a member of the audience that you're actually trying to reach.
Yeah, I feel like, sorry. I feel like a little bit of what comes up too, we all stand to gain from each other, right? And that's a fundamental, that's a starting point. If that's not where you're starting from, then we got some work to do, right? Because someone who is 18 and starting to work with me, and someone who is 65 and starting to work with me, I stand to learn something from any human who comes into the room with me. And if that's not the space that you're coming from, then that's where conflict starts to arise, right? And I think the other thing that kind of comes to mind, like in the story that you just told, Terell, of that younger person who preferred doing this over technology. So we got to start asking questions, right, about, okay, so I see that this is your preference, right? Here's what I see as a potential solution. Like, what does that bring up for you? And then you can have a conversation with that person about, like, a potential solution. But if you had come in and said, this is the answer, you can't do this anymore, that would be a really different experience for that person. So acknowledging, like, that generation is a generation that didn't know life without a phone, right? And in the other way, I know I've learned a lot about human interaction from my grandmother, right? And understanding the value of oral conversation, oral history. So I think it's really important that we acknowledge that we stand to gain something from everyone in this space. And I think when we start to get kind of protective about our age, like it being the youngest person in the room or the youngest leader in the room, that's when issues of identity start to come up, and that's when things get really fixed. Like, I'm the youngest person, so now I feel really protective of anything I'm saying, and I feel nervous walking into a space. So you have to be aware of that as it's coming up, and you have to, in whatever position you're in, whether you're older, younger, the only person of color in the room, everyone has had an experience like that of feeling on edge. Be aware of the aspects of your identity that are getting stuck, that feel really terrifying when you're in a space, and be aware of what power you hold.
And I think related to that, all of what's been shared, like naming ageism, right, as a system of oppression, period, right? And it intersects with others. And even like, I'm 41 now, and I'm on a board of an arts organization in DC, and several years ago, I just celebrated my birthday. And one of the other board members, when I shared this before a board meeting, older white woman, was like, oh, is he old enough to be on a board? And like, it also hits different when you're a person of color who's, this is being said about, right? I think related to the arts education field in general, I think that's a great opportunity to investigate how you center young people, right? Because if you're experiencing that as a staff member, that's probably a cultural, institutional thing, and I think you can begin to unpack by really looking at how do you center young people and youth voice in your institution, because I think unless you get to that, it's not going to change the culture enough for you to then feel also like ageism isn't affecting you, because if it's affecting you, it's for sure affecting them.
Thank you. I think we've got a question here. Yep, go ahead.
Good morning. I just really appreciate the honesty of naming things like power dynamics and all of that as we talk about having honest conversations. And the Phoenix project sounds very interesting, Angelica. Thanks for sharing that. But I'm wondering, in relation to Nexus, what you brought up about only having honest conversations when there's a facilitator involved. I've definitely kind of experienced that. So how do we, any practices that you all have, to suggest or offer on how do we set the culture of, I want to hear when, when someone doesn't like something, or, saying that in the moment, but then also like acknowledging the power dynamics and making space, because I'm afraid that if, from leadership there is, oh, I don't like this, saying that in that moment, that if that comes so much more from the leadership and not from like making that space to hear it from the entire team, that's going to shut down folks way more. So yeah, just kind of any other tips on setting those practices. Thank you.
I think, and I'm probably not going to answer this question as directly as some other people, I think part of this is also acknowledging and realizing that the more diverse any organization or community is, the more you will experience tension, if not conflict. And so unless you're putting in place ways to not just like deal with feelings with people in power, but also conflict in general, like conflict adverse is not the goal, conflict resiliency is, right? And so I don't think you can get to there without having a plan to address those kind of situations, because it's gonna feel weird for people in power, because that's how power perpetuates itself. And unless you again, have a plan in place related to conflict, and I'm just gonna keep drinking my chai.
On a more practical level, Nexus, you had actually mentioned, I think in your current or previous job, about having an anonymous survey, like after a meeting or something like that. So that may be one just very practical way. Again, acknowledging the power dynamic in the room, and that if an executive director asks for honesty, right, you may be putting folks in entry-level positions in this situation where they're not feeling comfortable because of that dynamic and not knowing how that's going to be received, or if that's going to put a target on your back. And I think this is especially true of folks of color. That's one thing that I've seen being used, is just an anonymous survey, so that you're not identifying yourself, and that way the executives can kind of see more candidly and totally anonymously like what folks are thinking.
If I could hop in with one more resource real quick. There's a resource called the Management Center online. If you haven't heard of it, I strongly recommend. And they have a great check-in agenda template that allows for space, not as anonymously, but for people to give feedback, going both ways. So definitely recommend Management Center, check-in agenda template.
I think to add to that too, like kind of not putting the burden on those people. Sometimes, like if you're a leader, you might have said something that maybe didn't sit well with people. We can read faces. So also I think it's important that people in leadership positions take the initiative to say, oh, that's not right, that's my bad. And so not putting the burden on someone else to tell you, because we can. So I think that's important too. That's kind of the other side of it for me. Is like calling out, you know what, that's my mistake, or maybe I could have said that differently. We could have did that differently, and that kind of also gives space for people to start to call things out too that you might have missed, if they know that you are a person that can receive it and turn it into a positive.
And I think just acknowledging the one difficulty within a lot of this is there has to be a certain level of awareness for leaders to make space for this. If especially if you've come up seeing people as just total authoritarian leaders, and you think that is the way to be, that is likely, ingrained in a lot of people's heads as this is the only way that I can think about it, and it is all about me. And you end up running into it, like I would run into a lot of challenges in terms of, how dare you bring up anything, because I don't have the awareness to realize that, as a leader, do not have the awareness to realize that this is a very serious thing. This person does have a voice. They do have a lot of that experience. And so that is the one challenge, especially within the arts, is that there is not enough awareness within leadership to acknowledge that it's not centered around any one person, especially in 2023.
I think the only other thing that's kind of coming in mind for me is making sure that you find moments of celebration and community with the people that you're working with. Like, I think that sometimes too it can just feel like the wins of an organization only belong to the leader, and a lot of like grants and leadership like grants end up focusing on just the leader when often there are like 15 people working with that leader to make the thing happen. And so making sure that wins are shared, making sure that people feel bought into the work that you're doing and that they understand that this is their work that's being celebrated, not yours, is I think really important for changing culture too.
All right, go ahead. Let's take our next question.
Hello, my name is Tehvon. I'm very, very shy, and it took a lot for me to get up here. But one of the things that resonates with me is the fact that that we're having these type of conversations, especially when you have somebody like me. I'm designed to be big and tall, and then on top of that, I have autism, which makes me feel small, and it makes me feel like I don't have much of a voice, because I'm afraid that I might be ridiculed. I'm afraid I might be talked about. It's a hard space to be in. So what would you say to someone that suffers from that?
First of all, thank you for getting up here and being brave. And I also just want to share that I'm a total introvert. Like, this is not my natural state. I'm usually the person literally way in the back row, taking things in and not saying a peep. To get up here and do this too, it takes that leap. So I really appreciate you sharing that. Angelica?
I guess what I have to say is just thank you for being willing to share anyway. And again, what comes to mind for me is just we have so much to gain from you. And unfortunately, a lot of the systems and the defaults that we've been talking about up here are what prevent us from gaining from you. And so I guess I want to acknowledge that and name that and say that it's really our responsibility to make sure that culture shifts so that we don't stop losing out on you. And it's not just you that we're losing out on. There's a room full of people in here that unfortunately often our society, our arts organizations, our creativity lose out on. And that is actually one of the biggest emergencies in our institutions right now.
I think related to that, just to trust yourself, to know yourself, right? Whatever was happening today in this moment, you felt called to do that. And if you're ever in a space where you don't feel that, that is as much, if not more, of a reflection of that space and organization you're in than you, right? As someone who has dealt with managing ADHD on a separate level, it took me a while to realize that I was in a lot of organizations that were not set up for my success, right? So just trust yourself and leave and find some other place that does serve you.
And always hold grace for yourself, even when that space does not do that for you. It's, the ability to have that grace for yourself and say, well, regardless of whether or not this conversation or this need was not expressed in the way that I wanted, or it was not received well, it does not make it any less valid. It's always a learning opportunity in terms of tweaking the message, but it is about that self-forgiveness and understanding that you are still, you still have a lot of power within what you do and what you contribute, whether it's at that organization or if it needs to be somewhere else. Because sometimes that's just the reality of you want to find a place where people want you there and they hold your opinions as valid.
All right, we've just got 1 minute left. Hopefully we can squeak in one last question here. Go ahead.
Hi, good morning. I love everything that you're saying, and you all seem to be great leaders and creating a great environment for your staff. My question is, what if we don't have that? Because you are addressing mostly leaders, but what if we're at the medium level? Is there any way that we can sort of navigate a system in which we do not have that shared space, that shared trust or shared power or a safe space? Is there any way that we sort of at the medium level can do to eventually, get to some sort of environment like that?
Well, I think the tough thing is sometimes it does take leaving that space, and there are spaces that are ready for you, ready for your talents, ready for your voice. That's a really tough thing. But I would say branch out of a space if you know it doesn't have the soil for you to flourish in. Sometimes it's a really tough thing to do, but really there are spaces out there that are ready to take you and ready for your talents and ready for your contributions. And so that's something that I would say can be incredibly effective, because sometimes you can give your all, and it just might not be the culture that's ready for it.
Yeah, you get to determine where your talents go, and that's the one thing that you're in charge of. And it can be really frustrating to hear that, and it can be really disappointing when you're working somewhere that you really love the work that you're doing. But also there are other places to work, and there's always somewhere else to go, and there's always someone else looking to support you, is what I found. So,
Unfortunately, we're out of time. I knew that this time would go by so fast. Thank you, panelists, so much for this very fruitful discussion.